Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, so we're going to begin. Good afternoon. I'm Mark Smith. I'm from the Microsoft Research Community Technologies Group. It is my great pleasure today to introduce two of our interns who will be presenting their work from the last several weeks of their time here in MSR. We have with us Alan Schussman, who is from the University of Arizona in the Department of Sociology, who is exploring the life cycles of news groups, their life and death over time based on the data drawn from our NetScan project. He'll be presenting first, and then we will be following up with Itai Himelboim's work. Itai is a graduate student at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Communications, studying the very interesting topic of discussion groups around political topics, and he'll be talking to us about people whose contributions cause conversation to erupt, what we call discussion starters or reply magnets. With that, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Alan Schussman, and then we'll have a few moments for a Q&A, and then we'll move on to Itai Himelboim's work. So, thank you, Alan. Well,
all right. Well, thanks, Mark. As Mark said, I'm coming from the University of Arizona, where I'm finishing a PhD in sociology. So by training and aggressive socialization, the work that I'm interested in is in the realm of complex organizations and how people act within those organizations, and how organizations persist and achieve some kind of measure of success, or in other situations how they come to fail, and in identifying ways to systematically make measurements of these sorts of things and assess the forces through which people can engage in collective action, essentially. So as Mark indicated, I'm working with the NetScan data, and the way that the NetScan data fits into the research agenda that I'm engaged with emerges from an initial interest in what we could think of as a kind of ecology of Usenet, or ecology of collective action online, much more generally. Organizational ecology comes out of a set of thinking that when we take large sets of organizations, we can look at them as existing as broad populations that may share dynamics in terms of size, of density, of population, of activity, and that we can assess things such as competition among organizations within a large set. So questions emerge, for example, such as the carrying capacity of groups within populations, as well as populations within resource spaces. And then much more broad questions about the ways in which groups emerge and the ways in which groups die due to these sorts of forces. There's a sort of top-down perspective which has to do with group birth and death very broadly, as well as a sort of more bottom-up perspective that has to do with groups as spaces that rely on attention or on participation or on users, essentially, in the context of organizations as resources that groups need in order to persist. The questions that I'm talking about today emerge generally from this second category here, broad processes of group birth and death, and draws on observations that have been made in the past that on Usenet, groups don't really die, they simply persist. And one of the key questions is, what is the state in which they actually persist? Are they active, or, as Spencer and Lawrence write in talking about administering Usenet, are they simply empty shells of groups that persist? So what I'm speaking about today and what the following consists of are some attempts to measure very broadly and assess some metrics at a very, very broad macro level. How can we determine if groups are active, essentially? And can we use that determination to think about ways in which groups, in Usenet specifically, but hopefully eventually to broaden to additional kinds of online communities and so forth, can we make some general statements about these sorts of processes in these kinds of groups? So the data in particular that I'm working with, I'm looking at groups drawn from NetScan whose emergence, their birth essentially, was observed in NetScan. This means groups whose first post came, in this case, the sample that I drew since 2002. there are 300-some thousand of these groups. And this is in large part a function of the way that netscan identifies what a group is. If, for instance, you post to alt.politicsis, that still is caught. You mean alt-politics, but netscan doesn't know. Same with rec.clibming. So we want to exclude these groups from this consideration, but include things that probably are actual groups. alt.os.parents, the French PHP language discussion group. So I make a second pass at this 300,000 plus groups, looking for what ought to be more like real groups. Filter groups down that have at least 100 posts by 10 or more authors within the first 90 days. This cuts this 300,000 dramatically. Further, I filter it a little bit more, taking out the binary groups, which have very different kinds of patterns of interaction and posting, and restrict it to the big 9 hierarchy, which is essentially the alt. Hierarchy, plus those groups such as comp. Misc. Talk. Referred to as the big 8 or the managed Usenet hierarchies. Finally, because I'm interested in groups that I can look at over some kind of longitudinal period, I filter that one more step by groups whose age of first post or time from first post was at least 2 years ago. And that yields a final set of 424 groups under consideration here. This slide is just a histogram, so you can see the sort of pattern of these foundings over time. This is actually the set of 605 before I make that 2-year filter. And you can see the general decline in group foundings over time, as well as these periodic big spikes. And to make sure that these spikes weren't, for example, new servers coming online or new servers being discovered by Netscape, I've sampled along these time periods to identify these groups and verify that indeed they actually are periods of new groups emerging rather than old groups that are suddenly identified. And it looks as if they indeed are. One potential explanation for this has been observed by lots of folks who have looked at NetScan data in the past, is that use of Usenet really does cycle periodically. So when people come back to college, Usenet use spikes. So we might be seeing a similar sort of pattern here with foundings. So having identified these groups then, this broad pattern of emergence, we can look at more specifically at a couple of key group metrics. What actually happens within these groups over time? And here's one example. Here are a couple of examples of some of these metrics measured over time for 2 new groups. The left-hand side of the plot is day of first post. And these are 2-year snapshots of activity in these 2 groups, alt.comp.linux sucks and alt.comp OS Windows XP. And you can see the broad movement of posts and activity in these groups. Red here signifies posts within the group. Blue are messages that are cross-posted, i.e. groups that are posted to this group as well as to other groups. And the orange line are replies that are posted within that group. And you can see, for example, on the Windows XP discussion, that replies tracks somewhat in a slightly lower magnitude way the overall posts. So we can measure these sorts of things, we can look at them, and most of the analysis and the consideration I've done then emerges from basically starting out by looking at a whole lot of these and trying to make sense of general patterns that seem to be taking place. So looking at a couple of hundred of these and looking in particular at trying to think about, well, what kinds of signals might pop up when a group is dead? Or in other words, how might you identify when a group is inactive or defunct? I started to notice what seemed to be kind of a pattern. And that is that if I looked at some late point in a group's life cycle and assessed its activity, if that group looked dead late in life, I saw over and over it never really lived. And so this moves on to the sort of key of the analysis here, which is how often does that actually take place? If it's the case, in other words, that groups that look like they're defunct were never really active groups, if they were never really places where people engaged in conversation, where people asked and answered questions, well, did they ever do that? And if that's the case, can we generalize that to active groups? To rephrase the question then for them, if you observe a group as being active at one point in time, what are the odds? What's the likelihood that the group has always looked that way? Much more broadly then, the rephrasing of that question is, do groups actually change? If groups are active at one point in time, how reliably can we expect that they'll be active at another point in time? And that's the question that the rest of the talk essentially pursues. Can we find a way to take a measurement at one point in a newsgroup's life, and with what degree of certainty can we expect that at another point in its life it's going to look about the same? This has implications then for resources that we put into defunct or thriving communities. And as I'll discuss, both the measurement I think is kind of interesting, and the ultimate findings do have some implications there. All right, so determining from 30,000 feet up whether a news group is active isn't necessarily straightforward. There's a fair amount of research on the subject of looking at group activity, but the measurements so far have not. One problem with many of the measurements is that they're very complicated. They use some variation on counts of a number of these things: cross posts, returnees, which are people who come to the group at one point in time and return to the group again, replies, how long are threads, counting spam. The measurement that I use is simpler, but it looks to at least have a fairly high degree of accuracy, as I'll suggest. And for a first pass, it provides a pretty good metric at assessing how active groups really are. So the things that I want to know in putting together this measurement: first of all, how strong is the actual group identity? In other words, is a group dominated by cross posts, or is there activity going on that seems to be exclusive to the group? And so I take a tack at this in a couple of ways. First, I look at cross posts. Second, I look at activity that is exclusive to the group, and that implies some kind of back and forth. So I find this by measuring replies, and not simply all replies, but replies that are exclusive to the group, i.e. not cross-posted, and are not replies to oneself. So a reply that is not counted, for example, is when I make a post to a group and say, hey, is anybody here? And then 2 weeks later, I bump my post by replying to it and say, how come nobody's here? That kind of reply doesn't get counted. So from looking at those, I put together a very simple measurement of status that's coded dichotomously. Status equals 1, or a group is active, if at a given point of measurement, the number of replies in the group is at least a tenth of the number of cross posts. And I take this measurement twice, at 6 weeks into a group's history and at 18 months into a group's history. And then we essentially see if status at those two time periods is approximately the same. Sampling to see if this measurement makes sense suggests that it does. In other words, when I identify a group as active programmatically, and then go in and look and actually read the group at that time period, it looks like there's actually something meaningful going on there. It may be at a very low magnitude. Remember, activity on Usenet varies a tremendous amount. So these may be small groups, but they're groups nonetheless, in a fairly good number of cases. So of the 424 groups then, when I apply this measurement, how often does status at T2 look about the same as status at T1? Overall, it's really high, 84%. So in more than 8 out of 10 groups, a group that is active at time 1 is probably going to be active at time 2. The same goes for inactivity. And in fact, the relationship for inactivity is even stronger. You're very likely to know, in other words, at 6 to 8 weeks, if a group is going to make it at 18 months, at a year and a half. And you can see here as well that the measurement for inactivity is quite a bit, the false negative rate essentially is quite a bit lower than the false positive rate. And I can discuss a couple of the implications of that and ways that measurement then might be tuned to reduce those. So this, I think, is really fairly significant. We might be able to anticipate whether or not resources put into, say, managing the community are going to pay off, and know that really early on. Know it after 2 months rather than watching it for 6 months and waiting. So I'll walk through a handful of cases of what these generally look like. The top row here, the Alt-Autos Citroën group and that French PHP language group, these are representative of the groups that at time 1 and at time 2 look like real news groups. In other words, it looks like something is really happening there. Alt.Canada sucks, and Alt.Checkmate and Noxy are examples of groups that were identified as inactive at time 1 and also are identified as inactive at time 2. This pattern, this initial spike in cross-posts that you see in both of those, is really characteristics of groups that never really amount to anything. One of the interesting things, though, is that the initial spike in cross-posts often lasts just long enough that every handful of weeks you get a little blip in the group later. And that little blip means that the cross-posts made it look like there was a group there just long enough to land on a spammers list. Subsequent posts in most of these groups are spam. So these are representative of those sort of success cases, those 70 to 90% of cases where groups do look at time 2 like they do at time 1. So how about the cases where they don't, where they differ? These are pretty instructive as well, and I think provide some interesting ways of thinking about the dynamics that are actually going on in groups, i.e. what are people doing, as well as how can we tune this measurement a little bit more. Starting off with groups that were identified as active at time 1 and then turned out to be inactive at time 2. You can think of these as false positives. Both of these two groups are what you could think of as read-only groups. They're small numbers of individuals posting news, or in the second case, rec.art's books excerpts, they're posting chapters from books. And the norms in both of these groups is not conversation, but essentially one-way pushing out of information. And so there's a reasonable question here as to whether we should consider these as groups at all. If they're one-way channels, do they belong in the set of things that we consider as places where dialogue takes place, essentially? But what happens is, early on in their lives, they were just active enough to be coded as active by the measurement that I've currently used. Some things identified as groups, and these look similar to those groups that were inactive and also inactive, right? Some groups were basically never groups, just like in those other cases. But as in the previous slide, they're active just long enough early on in their life to look like a group. Alt.Forrest Gump rules. We can assess from looking at this plot that nothing really ever happened there. One interesting thing about both of these plots. Notice the overall ratio of posts to cross posts. It's very, very high. This is probably something that can be used to tune the activity measurement to make it more precise. Generally, where cross post ratios are this high over the whole life of a group, very little happened there. Yeah, Schussman?
How did you decide on the 18th month period? Like,
to use 18 months?
Yeah, what did you pick that?
It was essentially an arbitrary decision. I wanted to have some time after time 2 to look at what continues to happen, and it seemed like halfway between. It seemed like basically cutting it at a year and a half, leaving me 6 months to look post that period seemed like a reasonable thing to do.
It just seems like in a lot of the examples that you've shown that the initial burst lasts fairly a short amount of time, like maybe 3 or 4 months or something. Like that.
You mean like this initial short?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So I wonder if you might, even if it might do with lower prediction accuracy, you might be able to, make some kind of prediction
by pulling time 2 back earlier.
Yeah.
I think it'd be really reasonable and probably show something interesting to have several staggered cut points to see, where do you kind of maximize prediction versus where do you really get fewest false positives and that sort of thing. So yeah. All right. A few groups, not the norm though, in the set that were coded as active and then later inactive, really do seem to die. This actually doesn't happen as often as I expected that it would. So this French group discussing Crohn's disease, it looks like it's active for a little while. It looks like there's really something going on there. But like Schussman says, by 4 or 5 months, there's not a whole lot going on. At least in the set that I've seen here so far, though, this doesn't take place very often. In other words, it doesn't seem to take place very often that a group has a lot of activity and then simply disappears. There are some interesting stories about what might be happening in these groups. There's a group called os.parenting, for example, that's really active. It's cruising along for a period of a couple of years, or a year and a half at least, and then it tails off and disappears. In that last handful of months of its really active period, it starts getting highly cross-posted to another Australian group, aus.family, and it looks like the traffic moves there. So when it's the case that groups really do seem to die, at least in some, the narrative makes sense that that traffic is moving somewhere else. And it looks like empirically that at least in some cases that's exactly what's happening. In other cases, finally, the time 2 just misses the window. This looks like a pretty active group, this Amiga group. But at time 2 for the 1 month window of measurement just didn't find the activity that was expected. All right, briefly looking at groups that go the other way. In other words, groups that look inactive at time 1 according to this measurement, but then turn out to be active by the measurement at time 2. alt.military.retired.recipes is probably my very favorite news group. It starts out being massively cross-posted, 95%, 98% to alt.food or alt.recipes. And then all activity ceases. It almost completely drops off the map for a pretty small period of time. And then people start posting, again, exclusively to alt.military.retired.recipes. And it's full of recipes. They actually are posting recipes here. Mud pies, cakes, ribs, you name it, people are posting about it there. One interesting caveat about this kind of situation is that you can see that the reply counts in this group are fairly low. So again, we could consider, is this a kind of one-way traffic group? And if that's the case, does it make sense to include it in this set of groups that we're thinking about? And that I think you could make an argument sort of both ways there. But certainly there are other cases where groups that are inactive do become genuine discussion groups, as in the case of Alt TV Stargate Atlantis. One of the really interesting things about these TV groups, just as a side note, is that a lot of them, very many of them, exhibit this interesting kind of cyclical pattern. So, this is season 3 starting. This is season 4 starting. And it's really interesting to see that happen. You see it with groups about Lost, Doctor Who, other shows. It's kind of fun to watch that happen. Other groups, finally, as in many of these cases, make it by only the narrowest of margins. So again, it underscores the need to essentially tune this measurement, to make it a little bit more sensitive to additional kinds of activity going on in the groups, specifically to think about the magnitude of this activity. So improving the measurements, a couple of things that I think would make a big difference. First, as I've suggested, is a sensitivity to the cross-post ratio. If a group has a cross-post ratio of 90+%, it's pretty likely that there's very little of the kind of interaction going on there that, at least to my eyes, makes for a meaningful group. In other words, if it's important that a group have some kind of self-contained content, if 90% of what goes on there is also happening someplace else, you're probably missing that. So adding some sensitivity to the cross-post ratio, as well as paying attention to the actual magnitude of posts. How many replies are really being made here? The current measurement is really insensitive to that. The prior group here, Alt Current Events War on Terror, time 2 has 1 reply, and that's enough to make the threshold. So the counting of replies clearly can be tuned. What will happen in the process of doing this is that the set of groups that are coded as active will go down. We'll reduce fairly significantly, I think, that category of false positives, essentially, groups that are expected to be active because of a measurement error, essentially. Another improvement to this measurement that I think would be really interesting, and I'd really welcome suggestions and comments on how to pursue it, would be a non-dichotomous variable. Essentially, can we code activity from low to high with gradations, rather than simply expecting that groups be active or inactive? I think this makes a lot of sense, especially based on the fact that, as we know, activity in Usenet across groups is going to vary so much, and vary a lot temporally. So a good, reliable measure of activity relative to other kinds of activity would, I think, be really productive here. And so those are some of the considerations that I think of as I consider how to move forward with this. Okay, a couple of implications and concluding words. The first are some very pragmatic things. These numbers suggest essentially that we can know really early on what a group, what an online community might look like in a couple of years. We have slightly less precision on whether, on the question of whether that group will be successful, will it be active, but we have a pretty good amount of precision, at least at this stage, of knowing that it's not going to be active. So you know at 6 to 8 weeks if a group is doomed. And if at 6 to 8 weeks you can decide not to put energy into it, not to have moderators continue to work in the group, not to continue to provide resources and so on, that's a really pretty significant piece of information to carry forth. Conversely, if at 6 to 8 weeks it looks like your planting has succeeded, we might be pretty sure that in a couple of years you still have a pretty good garden. And I think these can be really important pieces of information moving forward as we think about how to put together, how to predict, and how to plan things like online communities. Secondarily, one of the findings that seems to appear over and over as we look at these plots and as we look at the predictions between time 1 and time 2 is that cross-posting really does seem to matter, both in terms of tuning the measurement as well as identifying this process by which people come into groups. A lot of successful groups have initial high rates of cross-posting that then taper off, and then the group becomes a real thing, a real social place. So the implication then is that you can bring people to the group by identifying like places, by identifying places where there's affinity. But the caveat to that is that you can't rely on that traffic. Secondly, a few more implications for further research more generally, for the sociologists and those types of folks. One of the things that I think is really striking about this is that there's relatively little death taking place here. You know, the odds are about 50-50 based on the populations, but if 50% of new groups become some kind of social space, then there's an interesting dynamic. First of all, it's a corrective to the suggestion that, hey, nothing is taking place on Usenet. There are a couple of hundred new groups that seem to be places where people are coming back to and engaging in conversation built over the last handful of years, and that I think should be taken seriously. Finally, there's this really intriguing kind of durability of new social spaces. This suggests that building social spaces online may be very difficult in some cases, but it may also simply take the right set of circumstances and the right timing, and it may only take a relatively small amount of that effort to build a social space. So not only are people creating some kind of nominally meaningful place online for conversation or for sharing information, but once they reach a certain level of use, those spaces seem to persist. And when we're concerned about things like, you know, social creation of community spaces, I think that's a really interesting sort of thing to find, and I'd welcome conversation about that. So finally, a couple of points of further reading if you're interested either in organizational ecology or following up on some of these newsgroup studies. These are just a few of the specific things that I've referred to. And finally, of course, thanks to all the folks who brought me here. Mark, Danielle and I have had lots of ongoing conversations about the project and where it's going. Paul has helped with database stuff a great deal, and Itai has been a good cordial office mate. So thank you. I'd welcome questions or conversation or anything.
We can either raise questions now or hold them to the end, but you know, if you have questions now, I'm sure we can manage them. I can go either way.
Or just a small question. I was just wondering if you had access, or if you were able to look at who was posting and.
I couldn't hear the.
I was just wondering if you were able to look at who was posting to each of these news groups and whether or not you think that the original kind of group of people who were initially there when it first started, if they were still active, like later on, would that be a good picture? Or?
I haven't looked at that yet. I agree that that's something important to look at. I mean, I know that, for instance, in those groups that look like read-only groups, it's a really small number of people who seem to be posting over much of the group's history. Other groups I'm not sure about. On one hand, I guess I think there are two ways to think about the importance of people returning. One is that obviously if the same people create a group and return to it over the course of years, they've really carved themselves out a niche. On the other hand, if you see new people coming in, people sort of cycling in and out, that might be an even more important kind of group because it's more visible. So I think you could sort of go either way there, but I absolutely agree that looking at who is coming in and out is important. I haven't done it yet. But, yeah. Other things? Yeah.
It seems like it'd be interesting to explore the extent to which the news group birth and death are connected. It seems like there's got to be a conservation law to some extent as people move around trying to find more specific venue for their conversations.
Yeah,
I've been a part of news groups that for a while, somebody got mad, it's an authority news group, and
yeah.
a lot of people follow them, and it's a new magnet. So it's not like the creation of the new one and its success results in the death of the one that was.
Yeah, and that in fact is one of the sort of tenets of this whole ecology thing, that you only have so much attention to give around and that sort of thing. And it clearly seems to happen in some cases, like the os.parents group. It basically tapers off, and those people went over to alt.os.family. One of the really interesting things that I saw when looking at that, though, is that there was no sort of discussion about that. They just kind of migrated. So the extent to which that's a conscientious process, or the conversation moved and it had enough momentum that they never went back, I think is a really interesting social process that at some way has got to underlie that kind of ecological process of density and of limited attention and that sort of thing. Yeah.
How similar do you think it would be in other media? So email DLs, for example, and that would be another, Yahoo, other types of groups which may be hard to get access to. But here at Microsoft, there's so many DLs, like social computing discussion has a lot of cross-posting with, Lightbulb or whatever, and so. And some of these same dynamics happen, right? Certain people all of a sudden start posting to some different DL, and the conversation sort of picks up there when it left off somewhere else. So I think some of those same patterns seem to exist elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I think that you're certainly right that similar kinds of things must be happening elsewhere. I'm reluctant to say that I'd expect to see the same thing like on email lists, for example. And this is just an intuition based on thinking about how people read news groups versus how they read mail. And this kind of process seems to work really well when you have to go out and look for stuff and conscientiously read and post. If the messages are coming into your inbox, which is certainly the case with newsreader clients and so on, but I simply don't know the comparisons of how those actual behaviors differ. But it's a good place to think about. It's certainly a good opportunity to a place like this where there's that data to try to find those differences in behavior and how they correspond to differences in life and death cycles, for sure. Yeah.
Did you look at the topic of the group at all in your study, where something like a TV show or a technology might come and go with a window based on current events or something, where something like parenting might naturally last forever?
I haven't specifically broken it down, and one reason is that I'm not sure where to start making those cuts. But clearly something is going on, say, with the TV groups in that they're cyclical. And if you measure them at the wrong point, they'll look dead when really they're just dormant. Whereas a parenting group, you would expect the activity to be more consistent. It would be really interesting, I think, to parse those out and to make cuts along topical lines. One thing that I've observed generally, aside from things like the Iraq War and these groups about war on terror and the Iraq War popping up, I haven't identified lots of groups that seem really rooted in a particular event. At least in this set. There may be other groups that preceded this set, or I may just simply have not come across them yet. But if they are there, I think you're right to expect that they would look different, be very active for some amount of time, and then cut off because no one's interested in talking about. Mark and I were talking about this earlier. The blizzard of '93. There are very few people who are still talking about that. If there was a group for it, it's probably catching spam every 3 or 4 weeks now. Yeah, Mark.
How wide are the T1 and T2 windows? And would this become more robust if, let's say, it was a 30-day trailing average rather than a one-day measure?
It's an average taken over a period of a month.
Oh, it is. So
yeah.
It is a 30-day average.
Yeah, and I think I had that in the slide, but I may not have said it out loud. So it is a measurement taken over a month with data aggregated into weekly chunks. So 4 weeks averaged make up that window, which seems like it ought to be wide enough to catch small lulls, but not so wide that it gives you a false impression of what's going on. But clearly, in some cases, it does actually miss activity. So that's hard to find.
As a follow-up, so you found some news groups that have a period of hibernation. Any of them start moribund and then eventually sort of, I guess I'm thinking of a gestation time. Are there any that just, it took a year before people really just came to it? Or were there just none that actually fit that model?
I haven't seen groups that take that much time to take off. But in some ways, it may be a question of sampling. We don't know, a group that hasn't been posted to doesn't exist yet. So there's kind of a data question there. But in cases where there's a little bit of activity, but not enough so that we would think a group is active, it doesn't seem to take that much time before you could make that determination. So, military retired recipes took 6 weeks, 12 weeks, maybe 5 months, and we know. So, which is longer than you might think, certainly. But that's probably the longest kind of nascent time that I've seen in the set so far.
It says something about the efficiency of participants' awareness of topics of interest. That if they're interested, they'll eventually make it there in a pretty short period of time.
They'll find it. Yeah.
That's pretty neat.
And in the Stargate group, all of these cross posts are to alt.tv.stargate, right? So there's this. Someone at some point says we ought to have our own group, and they move over.
That's the jumpstart process working, just being slow about it. It sounds like.
Yeah.
So the Atlantis people were willing to live within the Stargate universe for a little while, eventually said, "Well, that's it."
Right, we're getting
these plot
out
lines have diverged.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we don't share enough anymore.
So that's interesting. In contrast, we saw a bunch of groups that used that jumpstart model and then smoothed out very fast, right?
And became nothing.
No, I'm sorry. Got started as successful, thriving groups. You showed us.
Oh, sure.
Alt.Windows XP one, for example.
Where are they?
Somewhere in there.
All the way at the beginning.
Oh, that one didn't start with the jumpstart, did it?
Not really. It had a shorter window, and in fact, this one just barely got caught by that measurement window as active. But there are some groups that emerge full bore, that from day one they have lots of activity, they have lots of posts, they have very few cross posts, and they just keep on trucking like that. And that's a really interesting story. There's a UK humor group that takes off with 500 posts on the first day, and I don't know where all those people came from. You can't see them before, and then they're there, and the group is there. So there's absolutely lots more going on here than this reveals, and certainly lots more questions to ask.
That case could be a forum that was offline, not published to NNTP and then began being published in.
That's possible, and in fact, I think that this group it might even have been a rec.group, so there could have been a proposal beforehand, before it was created, and the people were waiting for it to be officially created. Yeah, and that's a whole other process, where you have to moderate and create and write proposals and so on for group formation. Yeah.
Remind me what the max number is?
The max number just represents the magnitude of these lines.
Yeah.
So max here is 107 posts.
Some of those other ones that seemed a lot more obscure were like 400 and something. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, people go to obscure places to do stuff on the internet.
alt.comp.os.windows.xp to be distinguished from comp.os.windows.xp or Microsoft.public.windows.xp.
Right.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
which must be much, much higher.
Which are much, much bigger.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
I was gonna say
absolutely.
that seems odd.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could be looking at max for Windows XP in the Microsoft hierarchy of something like 6,000 in a week, 8,000 in a week.
Okay,
Yeah, those are huge. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
So
I should turn over
as
to
a point of
Itai.
segue, and I think to Kimberly's point, what we're going to hear from Itai is a bit about different kinds of people and the roles they play in these environments. And in some ways, we could combine these two approaches and say, is the presence of a discussion starter one of the indications of the vitality or future vitality of the news group? And so as they work through the AV transitions, and do you have your microphone? Do you have the
Oh, yeah, I probably should do that. I could do that thing where I go off to the bathroom and yeah.
Oh, yes, and then another round of applause for Alan. How about it?
Go somewhere here.
Post that where you find it most.
You sure about that?
All right, and here we go with Itai Himelboim from the University of Minnesota.
So, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. I am finishing my internship here at Community and Technology Group, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication in the University of Minnesota, where my dissertation is shaped around the area of social networks online on the individual and institutional level, all in the context of civil and democratic society. Today here, I'll present my work here at the group on political discussion groups. So if you want the political Usenet sphere, looking at preferential attachment and social roles. So I'm quite interested in political discussion groups because they play a central role in the political process in the democratic society, where people come and exchange opinions and ideas, learn about all kinds of information. Especially now online, there are numerous places when huge number of people come and post even more number of opinions and ideas, and so the internet become a host for this huge amount of political discussion. Now, the reason I'm looking at it from network perspective is that where so many people say so many opinions online, what becomes the scarce resource in a sense is getting attention to those people or to the content they bring to the discussion. Now, in discussion groups, a reply is a major way of showing attention to one's either to a message or to the author or to the thread it was published in. Now, we also know that people in discussion groups strive for replies. We know that people who get replies are more likely to come back. We know that studies shows that other people in the group tend to show more respect or appreciation to people who got lots of replies. There's actually even a term in psychology called cyber ostracism, referring to people who are being ignored online. And they show relation to being an issue of self-esteem and feeling of belongingness to the group. So people want replies. I guess that should be the bottom line here. Now, if you look in discussion groups, you typically, online political discussion group and like many other social networks, you tend to see this ball of spaghetti. To try to make some sense of it, we have, does that work? Should work. Yeah, we have pretty much every one of those red points are a participant, and the line that connects them is a reply. It goes from the person who made the reply to the person it was replied to. You can also usually find those really highly connected people in the network. You tend to get lots and disproportionate number of replies in the group. If you put it on more like graph, you can find out that, again, lots of people here get lots of responses when lots of people here get very little number of responses, where few people here get lots of responses. And we can also see it what's called a power law degree distribution when you pretty much put it a logarithmic scale. So that's pretty much the shape of the distribution. Now, this really uneven skew distribution where few people get a lot and lots of people get few leads me to two research directions. First, let's look at the entire dynamics in the groups that creates this structure of discussion groups. And preferential attachment, the assertion that people tend to attach themselves to highly attached people in the group, is one way to go with it. And the second is the kind of more the major part, is looking on social roles of discussion groups. It is to identify and visualize those unique individuals that take this unique social role, those individuals that attract lots of responses in the group. We build here on other research done on social roles on online discussion groups in the community and technology group. This, in potential, can have great implication for search mechanism, because pretty much we use very simple algorithm, which variation on in degrees, applying to already existing social mechanism in discussion groups, political discussion group, that tells us what are the topics that people talk about. It can potentially finding those social roles help us to reduce this huge number of messages and authors in political discussion into much smaller number of messages and authors that can tell us what people talk about. So let's start. Data. We use the NetScan data set for that is collected for the past more than 6 years now, and the community and technology group. 20 political groups for all kind of topics, local and broader and topical and so on, into 6 months periods of discussion, July to December 2006. It sounds like a good active time, a politically active time to get this information, because it's around the midterm election. And we have almost 40,000 participants and over 500,000 of posts. As basic measurements in the beginning, just get few, for all authors who participated in discussion threads, we got the post count, the number of replies they received, the number of replies they gave, the number of people who replied to them, and the number of people they replied to. So that's basically as a starting point. Now, a few words about, so the preferential attachment pretty much argue that nodes prefer to attach themselves with high connected nodes. In the context of discussion groups, it means that individual would more likely to reply to those people who have already been replied by many other participants in the group. The way to try and support it is pretty much look on different sizes of groups. So a little word about this graph over here. As you can see, there's two hypothetical groups where both of them have lots of people that get very few replies and very few people who get lots of replies. But still, those groups are different in the way the distribution is unequal at. In a sense, those people over here, they're still much richer, quote unquote, than most of the people. They got more replies, but they still got less number of replies than the people over here. In a way, the people in group B have more unequal distribution of replies than the people in group A. Now, if indeed we can find the preferential attachment is a dynamics that can potentially explain dynamics in political discussion groups, we would expect that the larger group gets more people in it, more people reply in it, will get those highly replied people get much more responses than in the smaller groups, because we have more people that prefer to reply to those people. So we expect kind of a negative correlation between the slope of the yield distribution here and the size of the group, number of authors and number of messages, which we found. We did find this negative correlation. It went between -0.4 and -0.5, was significant in all 6 months of discussions. So now we basically have a good starting point of understanding what's going on in those discussion groups. Sort of dynamics that create this very uneven distribution of replies among participants. The next step is pretty much reducing those large number of authors to those who actually start threads. Thread in discussion group starts by someone posting what's called a root message when he brings his information, opinion, anything, question, and then people decide whether they reply or do not reply to this group. So just to get an idea what's going on in those groups, we got two samples here. One random sample of 100 root messages from all the data I'm analyzing. And the other is the 5 top of the 5 largest threads in the group. And both of those samples showed similar findings. It seems like that in 75 to 80% of the cases, those people who thread starters go outside their group and they bring information for other places on the World Wide Web, such as news websites, blogs, other websites like political websites, and so on and so on and so on. They pretty much copy-paste it or link, but mainly copy-paste it to the first message. Most times also add some what they think about this piece of information, some personal comments, and that's how threads start. People then can reply and create a nice discussion around it, or not. But that's pretty much how those thread starters play a role of content importers. When you look on this group of thread starters, you pretty much learn that the more you give, the more you get. More specifically, you have a high positive correlation between what you give to the group, number of posts and number of threads, and number of replies you receive from the group. Number of direct replies, number of people who reply directly to you, number of replies in the thread, number of people who participate in the thread.
Is that corrected for contribution, or is that raw?
This is raw. It will be corrected in a second, but that's an important point. And again, in individual measures, if what you give or what you get, again, should not surprise us at the moment that create a skew distribution. Something like that. So now that we move from looking on almost all participants in the group, we narrow it down to look on those who start threads. And now we further narrow this huge data set down into those people who get disproportionate number of replies to other people in the group to messages they give. For threads they started. In a way, we're looking about people like this guy over here in the center, and this guy over there, which literally attracts much of the discussion to the messages or to the threads they started. I call them here reply magnets. Some definitions. Reply magnet was defined here as someone who posted at least 3 root messages. 3 is kind of arbitrary, but makes sense in the sense that we can define it as a behavior. I mean, if you did it once, you can't really define it as someone at least consistent behavior in a group. And had at least 10% fertility ratio. Fertility ratio is the fraction, that's where we correct for the size of the group. The fraction of replies in the discussion which happens in one's threads. It could be either replies directly to the root messages or other replies that happen in the threads that this person started. just as a side comment, we ran some sensitivity test of this 10%. We find out 5% gets lots of people here that posted very little and got lots of responses. We raise it up to 20%. You find out those people, most of the groups won't have any reply magnets. So 10% was found like good cut point. We found out about a handful of research magnets in each groups. It is in 12 of the 20 groups, those handful, usually 1 to 3, research reply magnets attracted more than half of the entire discussion in the group to their threads. It doesn't only attract a large proportion of the replies in the group. It also attracts a large proportion of the people who participated in the group. It's not like those flame wars, but one posted and the other replied to him and he replies back and it goes back and forth between two participants. You really see that it attracts a large proportion of the people in the group. And it does show a stable behavior. Research magnets, this group of unique people who got disproportionate number of replies in threads they start. We found that those people appear months after months after month, keep attracting large portions of the discussion, keep attracting large portion of the people to reply. Also found out that, and we'll talk about involvement ratio in a second, but some of them, that's all they do. I mean, there's people that all the messages they post are only thread starters. And for those research magnets, they tend to keep the same behavior across months. There are other people who had higher level of involvement in a sense. They did post starter threads, but they also were involved in discussing in their threads mainly, but also in other threads. So this kind of behavior or involvement level, if you like, also found to be consistent with those research magnets across time. And in the few cases they actually appeared across groups, they mainly did not. It usually happened across stayed stable across groups as well. In a way, reply magnets don't tell us what to say. They do tell us what to talk about. And that I'm going to mention in a second that have great implication for searching, for example. Now let's try and put it in context of other work and other social roles. Now, if on your left, you can see reply magnets, the kind we talked about, and this person gets a lot of replies sent to him over here, from the group to the guy. And that's what's important in political discussion groups, because those people bring information that is being discussed. However, if you look on technical support group and answer person in a study, a research that is done by and with collaboration of the community technology group, in technical support groups where people come to ask questions and get answers, what is important are the people actually reply back to the group. And those are the people, like answer people, that plays this unique social role in the group. To continue and now back to reply magnets, and we talk about different level of involvement. Those people that all they do is starting new threads, and some other are more involved by replying to other people in threads. So just visualize some examples here. This person, you see, all responses are, he only gets replies. Not even once he replied back to anyone in the group. As opposed to the person in the Politics England group, that this person in the middle truly got lots of replies from people, but he also replied back. They was a little small here, but I think you can see what I mean. So that's the person over here, that's the person over here. Now, interesting, those people have really extremely different level of involvement in the group. However, the fertility ratio, that is the fraction of discussion in the group that happen in their threads, is about the same. And indeed, there was no correlation between your involvement level and how much discussion your threads actually evokes. However, did find a positive correlation between the involvement ratio and the direct replies ratio. So what I'm trying to say that those people that they mainly post or only post thread-started root messages tend to evoke much more replies to the original message they posted, as opposed to people who are more involved that got lots of replies down the thread. Some implication and further research. So in general, we found out the reply magnets show they're a stable source of political discussion. They're going outside, bring information to the group, which starts threads where much of the discussion in this group take place. There are several implications here. First, for searching, like live search and other searches in discussion groups, other searches on the World Wide Web. This time it puts discussion in the context of the thread where it's taken places. So it gives us potentially the opportunity to reduce the huge amount of posts and authors in discussion groups to much smaller number. Like in those 20 groups, we started with about 40,000 messages, 40,000 authors, and more than 500,000 messages, and we end up having with few dozens of authors reply magnets and several hundreds of messages that can pretty much potentially tell us what are the topics that are being discussed. It's true that people sometimes can take a message and down the thread go and change the topic a little bit, and some of them even extremely. However, most of the replies tend to be relatively short to the really long piece of information they brought in the beginning, and especially in those research magnets that are magnets that all they do is starting root messages. We found out that they got most of the replies directly to the message, which is a better indication that that's actually what's being discussed. So implication for search for what people are talking about in discussion groups. Another implication is political campaigns. I was told by someone a few days ago, imagine what would make to political campaigns if you can know what people talk about at each point of time, or each month, or each week in time before election. Think about how can affect and how useful it can be creating campaigns. From more theoretical or academic perspective, it's really interesting to look at the sources of those messages. Because the internet really brings lots of alternatives, alternative quote unquote, or not in quotes, alternative sources of information like blogs and other discussion groups and web pages and so on. And an interesting question is, do people really go to those alternative places of information to bring to start threads or as topics of discussion, or are they going to the good old traditional CNN or BBC and so on, and the people are still relying on the traditional media for their discussions? So I do want to thank everybody here. Thank you, everybody in the group. Thank you, Mark, for bringing me and for all the support. Thank you, Danielle, for all the hard questions. And thank you, Ellen, for keeping up with me in the room, and everybody else, Paul, for being bugged so much. And that's it.
Well, how about questions for Itai?
Yeah.
I have a question. Of course. Did you find that these reply magnets evolved from another specific social role, or were they born as reply magnets?
That's, I think, a really interesting question for further research, because I did not look for the groups who were just started, as Ellen did. I was looking at the well-established groups. And I don't actually think that we even have the birth of the group in the data set. I will say that those people are not magicians. It's not that they bring something and already, right in the beginning, everybody replied to everything they said. Even after this period of time, they still work hard. They post a lot of messages. And although we see lots of discussion happening in those groups, not everything they say get lots of replies. So we may see some kind of evolvement process here, but I don't have them from the beginning. That's yes.
Follow up on that. I wonder if it's necessary to have the birth of the news group, but rather the birth of the author.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and I understand that this may be for future work, but would it be possible to go and look for the first message from some of these authors, or look for authors whose first message is in a particular time frame, and then look for their evolution, look for perhaps the number of people who eventually become replier magnets as a way of looking for that? And then I wonder if you could comment essentially to Kimberly's earlier point, which would be if there was a confluence of both the birth of the author and the birth of the news group, could you just hypothesize on the role of the discussion starter, the reply magnet, in making a news group more vital?
Actually, Alan and I already talked like a few weeks ago about the potential collaboration here, where yes, I mean, I think those people play such a central role in a discussion that we can indeed find that they may play a role in what makes a discussion still being live or die in a sense, or keep or change the level of activity. However, something interesting is sometimes that those groups are pretty flexible and adaptive. I mean, some of those threads, they were like, I don't know, resting for a month, and they didn't post as much, and I didn't really see, and that's for also for the research, we didn't really see much drop of the volume of the discussion when this person wasn't there. So I think they play a central role and really useful to find out what people are talking about, but it's not necessarily the case if they disappear for a month, everything breaks into pieces. Yeah.
Sort of a follow-up on that. How recent a development is the starter, is the thread starter? I mean, the way that you presented it, a lot of the technologies for pulling in the information that starts a thread, you know, have only been around for 3 or 4 years in some cases. You know, like what you talked about, RSS readers and things, and it sounded like you were saying they're taking content from that, sticking it into a news group, and that's the start of the thread. Mm-hmm. So did this role exist prior to that, and how did it happen? So one interesting analysis might be take a data sample from as early as we can go in the NetScan data set and do a similar analysis and see to what extent there were these thread starters.
Yeah, I agree.
Being somewhat old school, I can remember Usenet in 1993. And back in the day, people would actually type the first paragraph of a New York Times article with the newspaper in one hand, because there was no New York Times online. They would type in the headline and they would type the first paragraph.
So it still came from some media source, essentially.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been observed that bloggers comment on the news. They don't actually create it, in part because very few blogs have the budget of, let's say, the New York Times newsroom, which has to be, you know, several hundred people working, you know, developing new content.
I mean, in a typical, this must vary. I haven't read news groups as much recently, but like there's some bloggers, like political bloggers, who will, you know, the ratio of the contributed content to the to this, you know, the seed of material they start with varies greatly. Like there's some people who will be like, blah 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 blah, I think this is cool, and then other people who will be like, well, here's a quote from whoever, and then they go on and on and on this thing, and I wonder how much that might influence.
There's some genres of, like, link blog is a genre of blog where it's really just pointers to outside resources, versus commentary blogs, which are a mixture of links and some commentary on them.
And really,
you imagine that wouldn't probably drive. Oh, I'm sorry.
I would just quickly to follow up. I was just going to say, in the commentary could be the thing that actually starts the thread, right?
Well, right. That's the question.
Yeah.
It's sort of like probably the ratio of the text would tell you something about what people are responding to. Like, is it
in the commentary on all the Hillary video or whatever, the commentary was more interesting and sort of than the video itself.
And
right?
actually, you did see.
I think different.
You did see the
commentary. Exactly. Right here, EJ only read the commentary.
I only read the commentary, but that's more of a delivery than
You did see the people typically added their own comment. Like I think it was like out of, I don't know, 70, I don't remember now, out of 70-something% of bringing content, like most of those threads actually had someone actually saying what they think about this article or about the author before it's actually started. So it's a two-step flow in a sense from the media outside the discussion groups, and I'm careful not to say mass media here, to the discussion groups kind of mediated by those research magnets or thread starters.
Other commentary? I should note that Itai and áAlan will be available for conversation after this event. And for our remote viewers, they are available via email and for a reasonable fee, perhaps even in the flesh.
Sorry, one last question. I'm just wondering if, in the context of this last bit of discussion, do you know, have you guys or anybody else looked at the, because there's these measures or meta measures about the stuff you're talking about, is sort of about what's the decay time of the average conversation or something like that. And I wonder how much, is there a dependency of that on whether the source comes from like a mass media source or from something that's more user-generated content. So it's like, you know, I mean, because, so here's a mass media pundit would say, oh, well, of course, we make really good content. So if you start a thread with something that we say, well, then that'll generate lots of discussion. But if some plebe goes out and just says some random stuff, that'll die off after further response. I mean, I don't know. I mean, is that true? Maybe it goes
Actually, I didn't check the sources, and that's definitely something I want to do in Usenet, but on different era, we actually ran little research on blogs and where they bring the news. We found that it kind of go half and half, sometimes going from, and even by the way, when you go to blogs, you go to the A list, which is almost becoming a mass medium these days. Less likely to go to someone who tells about what the cats ate. Yes.
But did you see any like dependence on where that initially comes from as to the kinds of discussion that they generate?
I didn't go as much down that thread. From the other side, we did find out that newspapers have really interesting coverage of blogs.
Yeah.
In the sense that they're like, it's a good thing, pretty much, but they're not doing what we're doing.
Right.
So it's overall framed positively, and the only time it's not phrased positively when it seems like they kind of stepping into our area of the field. So that was pretty, interesting find we found in one study.
There are even TV shows now that go and surf blogs, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
You know, that you use this rich content platform to look at text
Watch
files.
on YouTube.
Yeah, I know.
Readers.
Actually, just in the news in CNN recently.
YouTube then sues Viacom.
And recently in the news, when all this thing with the conflict between White House and Congress, the CNN was saying that conservative bloggers are furious. I mean, there's actually a quote, and they argue that may affect the president's decisions. Like, okay. Lots of interesting interaction going on.
All right, so lots of very good futures for conversation analysis and discourse analysis in online communities. So we'll make the clapping sound again for Itai, and thank them both.
Thank you.
Itai,